Hello, today we're going to start our book called A Long Walk to Water. The book is written by the author Linda Sue Park. Naya is going to the pond to fetch water for her family, there and back twice. She walks for 8 hours every day. Selva is walking away from his ruined village to find safety. If there is any safety in his war-torn homeland, his journey across Africa to Ethiopia and then to Kenya and beyond will take many years. 2 young people, 2 stories, 1 country, Sudan. This mesmerizing dual narrative by Newbery medalist Linda Sue Park shows us that in a troubled country, determined survivors may find the future they are hoping for. Chapter 1, Southern Sudan, 2008. Going was easy. Going, the big plastic container held only air. Tall for her 11 years, Naya could switch it from one hand to the other, swing it by her side, or cradle it in both arms. She could even drag it behind her, bumping it off the ground and raising a tiny cloud of dust with each step. There was little weight going. There was only heat, the sun already baking the air even though it was long before noon. It would take her half the morning if she didn't stop along the way. Heat and time and thorns. Southern Sudan, 1985. Selva sat cross-legged on the bench. He kept his head turned towards the front, hands folded, back perfectly straight. Everything about him was paying attention to the teacher, except his eyes and his mind. His eyes kept flicking towards the window, beyond which he could see the road home. Just a little while longer, a few minutes more, and he would be walking on that road. The teacher droned on with the lesson about the Arabic language. Selva spoke the language of his Dinka tribe at home, but in school he learned Arabic, the official language of the Sudanese government, far away to the north. 11 years old on his last birthday, Selva was a good student. He already knew the lesson, which was why he was letting his mind wander down the road ahead of his body. Selva was well aware of how lucky he was to be able to go to school. He could not attend all year because during the dry season his family moved away from their village, but during the rainy season there was a school only half an hour's walk from his home. Selva's father was a successful man. He owned many head of cattle and worked as their village's judge, an honored, respected position. Selva had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. As each of the 4 boys reached the age of about 10 years, they were sent off to school. His older brothers Arik and Ring had gone to school before him, and last year it had been Selva's turn. Selva liked school well enough, but some days he wished he were still back at home herding cattle. He and his brothers, along with the sons of his father's other wives, would walk with the herds to the water holes, where there was good grazing nearby. Their responsibilities depended on how old they were. Selva's youngest brother, Kual, was now taking care of just 1 cow. Like his brothers before him, Kual would be in charge of more cows every year. Before Selva had begun going to school, he had helped look after the entire herd and his younger brother as well. The boys had to keep an eye on the cows, but the cows did not need much care. That left plenty of time to play. Selva and the other boys made cows out of clay. The more cows you could make, the richer you were. But they had to be fine, healthy animals. It took time to make a lump of clay look like a good cow. The boys would race each other to see who could make the most and best cows. Other times they would practice with their bows and arrows, shooting at small animals or birds. They weren't very good at this yet, but once in a while they got lucky. Those were the best days, when one of them managed to kill a ground squirrel or a rabbit, a guinea hen or a grouse. The boys' aimless play halted and there was suddenly much work to do. Some of them gathered sticks to build a fire, others helped clean and dress the animal. Then they roasted it over the fire. None of this took place quietly. Selva had his own opinion of how the fire should be built and how long the meat needed to cook, and so did each of the others. The fire needs to be bigger. It won't last long enough. We need more sticks. No, it's big enough already. Quick, turn it before it's ruined. Hold it higher. That way the outside won't burn, but the inside will still cook. The juices dripped and sizzled. A delicious smell filled the air. Finally, they couldn't wait 1 second longer. There was only enough for each boy to have a few bites, but oh, how delicious those bites were. Selva swallowed and turned his eyes back towards the teacher. He wished he hadn't recalled those times because the memories made him hungry. Milk. When he got home, he could have a lovely bowl of fresh milk that would keep his belly full until supper time. He knew just how it would be. His mother would rise from her work grinding meal and walk around to the side of the house that faced the road. She would shade her eyes with one hand, searching for him. From far off, he would see her bright orange headscarf, and he would raise his arm in greeting. By the time he reached the house, she would have gone inside to get his bowl of milk ready for him. Crack! The noise had come from outside. The teacher stopped talking for a moment. Every head in the room turned towards the window. Nothing. Silence. The teacher cleared his throat, which pulled the boy's attention back to the front of the room. He began speaking again, continuing the lesson where he had left off. Then crack, pop, pop, crack, ack, 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 ack. Everybody down, the teacher shouted. Some of the boys moved at once, ducking their heads and hunching over. Others sat frozen. their eyes and mouths wide. Selva covered his head with his hands but kept looking from side to side in a panic. The teacher edged his way to the window. He took a quick peek outside. The noise had stopped, but now the boys could hear people shouting and running. "Go, quickly, all of you," the teacher said, his voice low and urgent. "Into the bush. Do you hear me? Not home. Don't run home. They will be going into the villages. Stay away from the villages. Run into the bush." He went to the door and looked out again. "Go, all of you, now." The war had begun 2 years earlier. Selva did not understand much about it, but he knew that rebels from the southern part of Sudan, where he and his family lived, were fighting against the government which was based in the north. Most of the people who lived in the north were Muslim, and the government wanted all of Sudan to become an Islamic country. But the people in the south were of different religions and did not want to be forced to become Muslim. They began fighting for independence from the north. The fighting was scattered all around southern Sudan, and now, at last, the war had come to where Selva lived. The boys rose to their feet. Some of them were crying. The teacher began guiding the students out the door. Near the end of the line, Selva felt his heart beating so hard that its pulse pounded in his throat and ears. He wanted to shout, "I want to go home! I must go home!" But the words were blocked by the wild thumping in his throat. When he got to the door, he looked out. Everyone was running, men, children, women carrying babies. The air was full of dust that had been kicked up from all those running feet. Some of the men were shouting and waving guns. Selva saw all this with one glance. Then he was running too, running as hard as he could into the bush, away from home. A Long Walk to Water, Chapter 2. The story so far. Dragging a large, empty plastic container, 11-year-old Nayo still has miles to walk in the Sudanese heat. Selva, also 11, is at school when shots ring out and the teacher orders the students, all boys, to leave the classroom and run away from the village. Southern Sudan, 2008. Naya put the container down and sat on the ground. She always tried not to step on the thorny plants that grew along the path, but their thorns littered the ground everywhere. She looked at the bottom of her foot. There it was, a big thorn that had broken off right in the middle of her heel. Naya pushed at the skin around the thorn. Then she picked up another thorn and used it to poke and prod at the first thorn. She pressed her lips together against the pain. Southern Sudan, 1985. Boom! Selva turned and looked. Behind him, a huge black cloud of smoke rose. Flames darted out of its base. Overhead, a jet plane veered away like a sleek, evil bird. He couldn't see the school building anymore. It was shrouded by smoke and dust. He tripped and almost fell. No more looking back. It made him slower. Selva put his head down and ran. Selva ran until he could not run anymore. Then he walked for hours until the sun was nearly gone from the sky. Other people were walking too. There were too many of them all to be from the school village. They must have come from the whole area. As Selva walked, the same thoughts kept going through his head. Where are we going? Where is my family? When will I see them again? They stopped walking when it grew too dark to see the path. At first, everyone stood around uncertainly, speaking in tense whispers or silent with fear. Then a few of the men gathered and talked for a few moments. One of them called out, "Villages! Group yourself by villages. You will find someone you know." Selva wandered around until he heard the words, "Luarik, the village of Luarik, here." Relief flooded through him. Luarik was his village. He hurried towards the sound of the voice. A dozen or so people stood in a loose group at the side of the road. Selva scanned their faces quickly. There was no one from his family. He recognized a few people from the village, a woman with a baby, 2 men, a teenage girl, but no one he knew well. Still, it was comforting to see them. They spent the night right there by the road, the men taking shifts to keep watch. The next morning they began walking again. Selva stayed in the midst of the crowd with the other villagers from Luarik. In the early afternoon he saw a large group of soldiers on the road ahead. Word passed through the crowd, "It's the rebels! The rebels, those who were fighting against the government." Selva passed several rebels waiting by the side of the road. They each held a big gun. Their guns were not pointed at the crowd, but even so the soldiers seemed fierce and watchful. Some of the rebels who stood at the roadside then joined the back of the line. Now the villagers were surrounded by soldiers. What are they going to do to us? Where's my family? Late in the day the villagers arrived at the rebel camp. The soldiers ordered them to separate into 2 groups, men in one group, women and children, and the elderly in the other. Teenage boys, it seemed, were considered men, for there were boys who looked to be only a few years older than Selva joining the men's group. Selva hesitated for a moment. He was only 11, but he was the son of an important family. His father always told him to act like a man, to follow the model of his older brothers, and set a good example for Kual. Selva took a few steps towards the men. "Hey!" The soldier approached Selva and raised his gun. Selva froze. All he could see was the gun's huge barrel, black and gleaming, as it moved towards his face. The end of the barrel touched his chin. Selva felt his knees turn to water. He closed his eyes. "If I die now, I will never see my family again." Somehow this thought strengthened him enough to keep him from collapsing in terror. He took a deep breath and opened his eyes. The soldier was holding the gun with only one hand. He was not aiming it. He was using it to lift Selva's chin so he could get a better look at his face. "Over there," the soldier said. He moved the gun and pointed it towards the group of women and children. "You are not a man yet. Don't be in such a hurry." The man laughed and clapped Selva on the shoulder. Selva scurried away to the women's side. The next morning the rebels moved on from camp. The village men were forced to carry supplies, guns and mortars, shells and radio equipment. Selva watched as one man protested that he did not want to go with the rebels. A soldier hit him in the face with the butt of a gun. The man fell to the ground, bleeding. After that, none of the men objected. They shouldered the heavy equipment and left the camp. Everyone else began walking again. They took the opposite direction from the rebels, for wherever the rebels went, there would be fighting. Selva stayed with the group from Luarik. It was a smaller group now, without the men, and except for the infant, Selva was the only child. That evening they found a barn in which to spend the night. Selva tossed restlessly in the itchy hay. "Where are we going? Where is my family? When will I see them again?" It took him a long time to fall asleep. Even before he was fully awake, Selva could feel that something was wrong. He lay very still with his eyes still closed, trying to sense what it might be. Finally, he sat up and opened his eyes. No one else was in the barn. Selva stood so quickly that for a moment he felt dizzy. He rushed to the door and looked out. Nobody, nothing. They had left him. He was alone.